A todos ustedes. Muy buenas tardes a todos ustedes. Estamos en este evento paralelo, en este primer día de la Conferencia Estadística de las Américas. Y en este evento vamos a tratar los desafíos en la medición de la inversión extranjera directa y las principales tendencias en América Latina y el Caribe. Es un placer estar aquí con ustedes. Me está acompañando aquí en este evento la vicepresidenta del INEGI, Graciela Márquez, y le voy a pasar este evento. Tenemos dos presentaciones y va a estar moderado por Mr. Astrid Suslatarova, es el jefe de la Conferencia de las Naciones Unidas sobre Comercio y el Desarrollo en la UNCTAD. Thank you very much, Astrid, for being with us in this side event of the Statistics Conference of the America, and I want to give you the voice because you are the moderator of this side event, and it's a pleasure to have you here in this regard. And thank you, Maria Borga, and thank you, Cecilia, to be with you. Then I let you over to you, Astrid, and this is all my participation on this side event. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this side event to discuss the challenges in the measurement of foreign direct investment and major trends in Latin America and the Caribbean. Let me start by thanking ECLAC for organizing this event and for their kind invitation, distinguished panelists for accepting to share their experience, and for you joining the event. As you know, FDI can be a significant force for development and an important engine of growth. However, the positive impact of FDI does not materialize automatically. Policies matter. But without proper information on a country's or region's participation in the world economy, on the types of investment that comes in, or on the behavior of foreign affiliates, it is difficult to formulate sound policies. Data on FDI and activities of multinational enterprises is ever more difficult to collect, to analyze, and to interpret. That is because international financial flows are increasingly complex and because company structures are increasingly layered. These issues are already difficult for data compilers, but they are even more difficult for the users of data, especially if they want to use it to understand international production. But we strongly believe that FDI data continue to be relevant and important for measuring international production in a highly complex production landscape. To have a better understanding of the challenges of the measurement of FDI, we are glad to have here today with us Mrs. Maria Borga. Maria is the Deputy Chief in the Balance of Payments Division at the IMF, where she is playing a leading role in the update of international statistical standards, including the Balance of Payments Manual. Prior to joining the IMF, Maria served as a senior statistician at the OECD, where she oversaw the implementation of the OECD benchmark definition of the FDI, 4th edition. Before joining the OECD, Maria served as Assistant Division Chief for Research and Analysis in the Balance of Payments Division of the US Bureau of Economic Analysis. Maria, you have the floor to discuss the challenges and measurement of FDI. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Astrid. It's good to be here. And as I share my screen, I want to thank the organizers of this event. As you will see in my presentation, let's see, I hope that's good now. It is a very opportune time to be talking about the challenges in the measurement of foreign direct investment, because we are indeed in the process of updating the international statistical standards. And so we have the opportunity to make real progress on this. So I will start my talk with just a brief introduction to the update of the standards. And then I'll go through some issues in the current FDI statistics and how we are trying to address those measurement challenges. And it's tied in closely, I think, with work on better data for globalization, including data on multinational enterprises. And then I'll finish with just a little update on some of the other proposals that are being made for FDI statistics. So this is a rare opportunity. We update the statistical standards only about every 15 to 20 years. And right now we're updating both the System of National Accounts and Balance of Payments Manual. The goal is to publish these in 2025 and to have complete consistency between the two manuals. And there's been a particular focus on issues around globalization and the activities of multinational enterprises. And so the international statistical community has come together. We've organized the work through various task teams that are focusing on a particular topic and have a research agenda. There is a direct investment task team, which is a balance of payments only task team. And it is looking at issues around defining FDI, measurement and classification, special purpose entities, and things like that. There is also a globalization task team, and this is a joint task team of both SNA and balance of payments compilers. And this has many topics, but there is a particular focus on multinational enterprises. And so it's not surprising that this globalization task team's work is also related to foreign direct investment, given that FDI is a key aspect of globalization. We know that multinationals invest abroad for a variety of reasons, either seeking natural resources, access to markets, access to key inputs, or to locate stages of production in countries to take advantage of factor cost differences. And these foreign investments have created these long and somewhat complicated global production chains. And foreign direct investment actually is involved in the measurement of those, and in particular, seeks to measure long-term investments. I should mention that the OECD's benchmark definition of foreign direct investment is also being updated at the same time. And it will focus solely on direct investment. It will be consistent with the Balance of Payments Manual, but offers additional detail. So FDI statistics have always been the subject of a particular kind of tension. So they are part of the balance of payments and international investment position. And the focus there is on analyzing financial stability and interdependencies between economies. There's a focus in foreign direct investment on measuring financing and income, which is in line with this purpose. And the feeling was that there was a need to distinguish between portfolio investment and what we call direct investment, which involves the technical definition is the ownership of 10% or more of the voting power. And that owning that large a share of a company implies that it's a longer term and a more stable investment. We know that it's difficult, for example, to sell such a large stake in a company. Whereas portfolio investment, which is anything that falls below that 10% threshold, is shorter term, it's more volatile. We can see reversals in portfolio investment quite quickly. There is another difference between these two, and that is that portfolio investors are passive investors. They take the return that the investment provides, whereas direct investors, because they have influence or control over the investment, can influence that return. So they can provide important inputs, whether it's superior management, access to technology or knowledge, access to markets, to suppliers, or integration in global value chains that can be very valuable. So the advantage of FDI statistics is that because they're part of the balance of payments in IIP, they are reported by a large number of countries. So we had more than 170 economies report balance of payments data, and more than 160 report IIP data to the IMF. And this was according to the latest international standards. And I know that alignment with the latest standards is not perfect, but it does at least enhance the comparability between countries. And we have more than 110 economies that reported to the Coordinated Direct Investment Survey, which is a survey that looks at positions, the bilateral positions. So this makes direct investment obviously a very attractive potential data source for researchers and analysts. And so as a result, FDI statistics are often used or thought of as a proxy for M&E production. And as I said, the direct investors can supply many more things than the financing. And this is what a lot of researchers and analysts are interested in. And they're also interested in the real impacts on the economy. So not purely about the financing or income, but in terms of things like employment, wages, trade, and so on. And so the question is often asked, well, how good a proxy are they? And on this, there have been some doubts expressed. So one topic I think that has received the most attention is the tax optimization strategies of multinational enterprises. And what this often leads M&Es to do is to channel their investments through multiple locations. And these are often financial centers. And so what ends up happening is this inflates the FDI flows and positions because the direct investment is counted each time it goes into a country and out of a country, even if it's just passing through. It also makes it hard to identify the ultimate sources and destinations of investment. So this is an example from the CDIS. On the left hand, we see the top 10 foreign direct investment recipient economies in 2019. And so while countries like the United States and China, very large economies, make sense as receiving a lot of FDI, we also see that Netherlands and Luxembourg are in positions 2 and 3. And then when we look at the right and see the top 10 investing economies, again, we see the Netherlands and Luxembourg in positions 2 and 3, which implies that a lot of the investment going into those countries is then also just going out. And so this phenomenon has a number of names. It's been called pass-through investment or conduit FDI or even phantom FDI. And so then, as I said, one of the issues with this is it makes it very hard to understand what's the ultimate source of the foreign direct investment in your country. And this is obviously a very important question to know. And so I think it's not surprising that perhaps the most work has been done on answering this very fundamental question. And so there is a proposal for the update of the manuals that would be a supplemental presentation where economies would report not just by their immediate investor, which is what they currently report, for example, in the CDIS, but also by the ultimate investor. And so this is an example where we looked at data. We do collect data at the OECD on ultimate investor. So when I was there, this is an example. If you look at the right-hand side, this is for OECD countries, and we see that they reported Netherlands and Luxembourg as the 2 largest immediate direct investors in their economy. And you can see the United States was 5th. But when we looked at the data by ultimate investor, both the Netherlands and, well, Luxembourg fell quite considerably down in terms of the largest investors. And the United States expanded, but not just the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, France, all became more immediate, ultimate, or more important ultimate investors. And I think that makes sense. This begins to answer the question of who is really the ones investing in your economy. So I wanted to say something. I mentioned that this was a recommendation to have this as a supplemental presentation. There are quite a number of supplemental presentations that are being recommended for the update of the manuals. And there are a few reasons for this. First is that there is a desire not to overburden the central framework with a lot of additional detail, but it's also a way that countries with different resources available, as well as different statistical capacity, can then choose what presentations are most important for them and that they would like to implement. I should say that this presentation by Ultimate Investing Economy is one that is relatively easy for countries to implement. So if they're using a direct investment survey, for example, they can add a question on this. And so as a result, we've seen several countries like Egypt and Myanmar implement this presentation. So the counterpart to the ultimate investing economy is the ultimate host economy. This is obviously much more important for countries that are big outward investors. And it is a much more difficult question to answer, actually, because you have to look down the chain and allocate down the chain. So in terms of the update of the manual, we couldn't agree specifically on how to get all the way down the chain, but there was an agreement that countries should look through any special purpose entities to what's called the first operating affiliate. So a special purpose entity is an entity that doesn't have any real physical presence, very little or no employment in the host economy, and very little or no physical production. So it's actually not it won't have much impact in terms of the host economy. Most of its transactions are with foreigners or non-residents, and it's essentially performing an important function within the multinational, but not really contributing or having much impact in the host economy. And so this is an example from Brazil. And so what they did was they looked through to the ultimate destination for their outward investment. And you can see that the countries that gained considerably are shown, the gains are shown in blue, or light blue. And so they ended up showing much more investment in countries like the United States, Canada, Uruguay, whereas countries that had significant decreases were places like the British Virgin Islands, Luxembourg, Netherlands again, and Austria, where Brazilians actually have special purpose entities in Austria. And so this gives them a much better idea of where they're investing, and it also makes a lot more sense. I should say that this presentation also gives you a better idea of the industries that your firms are investing in. So when they're investing in special purpose entities, it shows up a lot in holding companies or financial companies, whereas you would be able to identify what specific industry they were in. So a country like Brazil, maybe, that would have large investors in natural resources would see that in these investments in places like the US or Canada. So up until now, I've talked about these two sort of presentations separately, but there are things that you can do. For example, I was talking about the ultimate investing economy applying to inward investment, but it can also be interesting to look at the ultimate investing economy of your outward investment. And this gives you an idea of the amount of pass-through. So in this case, this is something that Austria did, and they sought to identify the outward investment that was coming from truly Austrian firms. So this is their genuine outward investment. And they separately identified that from Austrian outward investment that was by firms that were ultimately foreign controlled. And so you can see that a high share of their outward investment was actually by foreign-owned firms. And What they did actually was look at the regional distribution, so in the table on the right, and what they could see, for example, is that there are a lot of German companies that are investing in Austria. Some of that stays in Austria. Some of it actually goes back to Germany. So that's an example of what we call round tripping. But a lot of it goes to other parts of Europe. And they also did this for other groupings. And so you can see additional round tripping, and you can see that a lot of investors use Austria then as a gateway for investing, for example, in Central and Eastern Europe. So there's another recommendation that's being considered for the update of the manuals, and this is looking at the type of FDI or the purpose of the foreign direct investment. And this specifically is focusing on mergers and acquisitions and greenfield investment. So actually in the fourth edition of the benchmark definition, which was published in 2008, there was a recommendation that countries compile equity capital flows that were going for mergers and acquisitions. And so in this left-hand chart, we can see that Canada does this, and the blue bars represent the amount of mergers and acquisitions, and then the orange is the remaining. So the total equity flows that weren't for mergers and acquisitions, and then the gray line is the equity capital flows that they had. So this, you can see a lot of the peaks, for example, are caused when there is a lot of merger and acquisition activity. There's an interesting case, a couple of cases actually, where there were divestments, right? So mergers and acquisitions were negative, which means that there were firms in Canada that were foreign owned that were then sold, and that ended up reducing equity capital flows. So this really can help users understand sometimes the volatility we see in equity capital flows. I should say that then, well, on the right-hand side, we have another example, and this is Ireland has actually been compiling data on greenfield investment. So in this case, they look at FDI transactions that went to create or establish new enterprises. And you can see here that that this tends not to be a very large share in the case of Ireland. It peaks at most at around 5%. But we do think that this could be very valuable in a lot of developing economies where we think the share of greenfield investment would be much higher. And so this really is trying to answer some of this question for policymakers of what is the impact of FDI in our economy. And so if you could show the greenfield investment as well as the FDI transactions that are going for what we call extensions of capacity, it would give you an idea of how FDI is helping to expand the productive capacity of the economy, and distinguish that from cases like mergers and acquisitions, where it's a change in ownership of existing assets. And so one advantage of FDI statistics, right, is that because they're part of the balance of payments and the international investment position, they can be used, they're part of this larger system of statistics, and they can be used in conjunction with these statistics. So I just wanted to give some examples where we have done this. So recently, the IMF released its climate indicators dashboard, and we came up with 2 sets of indicators related to foreign direct investment. So I'm going to talk here about the first one, and this combined foreign direct investment statistics by industry with information that comes from the CO2 emissions by industry, and also input-output tables that allow you to see the industries that are going into gross fixed capital formation. So the purpose of this indicator was to say, well, we know that direct investment, one of the things it does is finance new capital investment in host economies, but we also know that new capital investment will result in carbon emissions. So how significant are those? So what we did was we combined the data on FDI flows by industry with data on the CO2 emissions of gross fixed capital formation in those industries. And then we estimated the share of that gross fixed capital formation that was financed by FDI. So this chart shows from 2006 to 2015, in the blue line, the CO2 emissions from this new investment financed by FDI, and the gold line shows the total inward FDI flows. And what we see is that the two move together at the start, but then when we get toward the end of the period, when FDI flows started to recover, CO2 emissions remained lower. And what this indicates is that the countries are becoming more carbon efficient, I guess. They're generating less carbon emissions in those industries that go into these new investments, such as construction, manufacturing, and so on. So as I mentioned, there's a globalization task team, and they've been looking at, and there's also a current account task team, and they've been looking at better understanding the role of multinationals in trade. And so one of the things they have proposed is a voluntary breakdown of trade by ownership. So this would allow you to see the trade by multinationals or by domestic firms. But because we know that a lot of this globalization happens through FDI, they've also included a breakdown of direct investment income according to the residence of the direct investor. So this will allow you to understand how much of that direct investment income is ultimately from direct investors in your economy versus those that are ultimately foreign controlled. And so this was an attempt to capture the income effects of global production arrangements as well as the trade effects. However, if we have this data on trade by enterprise characteristics, by multinationals, we can use this to help us get a better understanding of the impacts of these global production arrangements. So I wanted to just give you an idea of some analysis we did when I was at the OECD on trade and value added and incorporating FDI income into that analysis. So we know that trade and value added breaks trade down between foreign value added and domestic value added. That domestic value added can be further broken down between domestic value added from domestic firms and also by foreign-owned firms. But that domestic value added of foreign-owned firms doesn't all remain in the economy. So the labor compensation they pay does, because they're for the most part hiring local workers. However, the profits that they make, the income that they earn from that can be repatriated back to the direct investor. And so this part is not, so we say it doesn't really stick in the economy, it can leave the economy. And so what this means is that in countries where foreign-owned firms play a large role in their integration in global value chains, people might be overstating the benefits in terms of the host economy. So we applied this, and if you look, this is for the OECD countries. So the blue, so this was their total exports of domestic value added. And so the blue part of each line is that by domestic firms. That completely stays in the host economy. The green part was the part they were paying in labor compensation. And then the gray hatch part are the profits that could be repatriated. And so you can see for some countries, this has quite an impact on where, on the amount of domestic value added that they're really exporting. And so, well, that was an interesting insight. So far, we've only said, well, some of this domestic value added might leave the economy. We haven't said where it goes yet. And so we also did an analysis of the benefits to the US of integration in NAFTA. And what this showed was that not only did the domestic value added that the US benefits from the domestic value added that they end up exporting under NAFTA. We looked at the FDI income payments that they pay to foreign investors. So that's the gray line below the chart, which we said, well, that would reduce these benefits. We added in, though, the FDI income receipts. And this is the income receipts that they receive from their foreign investments in Canada and Mexico. And so you can see that this actually raises the benefits that they receive. So it gives us a more complete picture of the potential benefits to economies when we look at this ownership aspect. And so just quickly, one other example I wanted to give, as I said, for the climate indicators dashboard, we said that we developed 2 indicators. So the first was to look at the carbon emissions from new investments financed by FDI, but of course, those firms continue to operate, and those operations will generate carbon emissions as well. And so what we wanted to see was what contribution do foreign-owned firms make to CO2 emissions in host economies. And so we used many of the same data sources, but also looked at data on the value added by industry, broken down between foreign-owned firms and domestic firms. And this is actually a recommendation that the Globalization Task Team is making for the update of the manuals, that countries should produce this breakdown. And what we did then was look at the carbon intensity. So this is CO2 emissions per unit of output. So this looks across different sectors and compares in the blue domestic-owned firms and in the gold multinational or foreign-owned firms in these economies. And you can see that in each industry, the domestic-owned firms are actually more carbon intensive than the foreign multinationals. And so, I mean, this makes sense. We know that foreign firms are often more productive. So it makes sense that they're also more productive in their use of carbon. But it also shows that these multinationals could be an important way that less carbon intensive technology gets distributed across countries. And then we also added in information on trade. And so this just shows some of the most carbon intensive economies. And the blue line shows again, the carbon intensity of multinationals. The yellow line shows the share of emissions by domestic firms that are exported. And the blue dots show the share of emissions of foreign-owned firms that exported. And what we see is that in some of these countries, these foreign-owned firms are not only contributing to their emissions, but much of their output is going to meet foreign demand rather than domestic demand. So I just wanted to say a few more things about the update of the standards. The good thing is that there will be no major changes in the definition of direct investment. So for countries that are thinking of improving their direct investment statistics, there shouldn't be any concern that, oh, in a few years we'll have new standards and things will change dramatically. There have been some other important changes that I didn't go into here. One is a sectoral breakdown of direct investment. This will be like the other functional categories of investment and will be very helpful to analysts. There's also a proposal on the reconciliation of flows and positions, as well as on the valuation of unlisted equity. And you can find more information on the update at this link I've included here. And so I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria, for the excellent presentation and the interesting topics that you covered in your presentation. Now, I would like, before going to the discussion, let me give the floor to our second speaker, Mrs. Cecilia Plotier. Cecilia is an economist at the Division of Production, Productivity and Management in ECLAC. She is part of the team responsible for the annual publication Foreign Direct Investment in Latin America and the Caribbean. She conducts research in international economics and industrial dynamics with a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. Cecilia today will discuss the main trends and challenges in FDI data in Latin America and the Caribbean. Cecilia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Astrid. And well, thank you also, Maria, for the presentation. It's always very interesting to listen to you. And muchas gracias. I will switch to Spanish now. Muchas gracias por la invitación a este evento paralelo de la conferencia. Es un honor para mí estar aquí. Y en este momento intento compartir mi pantalla. No sé si lo logré. Astrid, can you see my screen? Not yet, right?
Yes, I can see it, please.
Thank you. Great. Entonces, bueno, el objetivo de la presentación es compartir con ustedes algunas de las principales conclusiones que nosotros hemos sacado de utilizar estadísticas de inversión extranjera directa para justamente el análisis del comportamiento de las transnacionales en la región, ¿no? Entonces, la CEPAL, desde hace ya más de 25 años, investiga el fenómeno de la inversión extranjera directa. Publicamos un informe anual sobre la temática, donde se analizan las principales tendencias en la región y se presentan también algunos capítulos temáticos específicos. La motivación para hacer este estudio, como bien planteaba María en su presentación anterior, es justamente porque tanto para las asesores de política y para las empresas también es muy importante conocer el impacto de esta inversión en las economías y en el desarrollo. En esta línea nosotros planteamos como tres grandes grupos de motivaciones. Uno, claramente, la restricción macroeconómica, ¿no? de la restricción externa que tienen los países de la región, donde ahí sí un enfoque de balanza de pagos, donde uno vea simplemente el flujo de capital transfronterizo, tiene un sentido. Pero después también hay otras motivaciones más de tipo microeconómico y social, donde tratamos de identificar cómo el comportamiento de las transnacionales y los motivos para su inversión inciden en las economías donde estas empresas se instalan, el tipo de derrames que generan, derrames tecnológicos, tipo de empleo, y cuáles son esos costos de estas inversiones y los beneficios. Y en esta misma línea también una perspectiva desde el punto de vista político de cuáles tendrían que ser las políticas que implementen los países de nuestra región para sacar los mayores beneficios de estas inversiones y reducir las desventajas que pueden tener a veces la presencia de transnacionales en ciertos sectores. Y en la misma línea también aspectos geopolíticos que se dan porque muchas veces las empresas pertenecen a determinados países donde también hay motivaciones que van más allá de las motivaciones de mercado para invertir. Entonces, en general, el marco analítico que ha usado la CEPAL en estas décadas para analizar el tema claramente ha ido cambiando, pero siempre con una perspectiva muy cepalina, ¿no? De ver, bueno, cómo la inversión extranjera directa puede apoyar el cambio estructural, promover cambio tecnológico, mejorar productividad y también apoyar el desarrollo sostenible y en la lógica actual, digamos, de la visión de la Agenda 2030, el cumplimiento de los objetivos de desarrollo sostenible. Entonces, en la presentación, mi idea ahora es compartir con ustedes algunas de las principales fuentes de información que utilizamos y algunos resultados que eso nos permite obtener. En general, los datos de flujos de capital, como bien plantea María al inicio, o sea, estadísticas de balanza de pagos, que además son las fuentes oficiales que nosotros podemos utilizar y donde uno más claramente puede ver, bueno, cuáles son estos flujos de capital transfronterizo, pero justamente para cumplir estos objetivos de tipo más microeconómico y de política, es necesario complementar esta información con bases de datos que no son de fuentes oficiales, al menos a la fecha. En algunos países sí, hay información más desagregada oficial, pero en la gran mayoría de los países de América Latina y el Caribe no. Entonces, actualmente nosotros estamos utilizando dos bases de datos comerciales para tratar de identificar los anuncios de proyectos, que en general son inversiones de lo que se llama greenfield, inversiones nuevas, de nuevo capital, nuevos emprendimientos y fusiones y adquisiciones. Entonces, estas son como las dos grandes fuentes de información. Empezando con la información oficial de balanza de pagos, es el núcleo de lo que presentamos en los informes de inversión extranjera directa, utilizando la información justamente que se crea a nivel oficial en los países, principalmente por los bancos centrales. Y entonces, con esta información nosotros podemos monitorear justamente los flujos de capital transfronterizo que están ingresando a la región o que desde la región salen hacia el exterior. Nos permite tener datos que son comparables, si bien tienen esa comparabilidad también tiene sus limitaciones. En eso Astrid tiene mucha experiencia también en su trabajo en la UNTAD con el informe anual de inversiones. La comparabilidad de las balanzas de pagos a veces no es tan directa, pero donde en la región nosotros tenemos información todos los años para 32 países, que actualmente se está presentando en la gran mayoría de los países, de acuerdo a la metodología del Manual de Balanza de Pago 6, que tiene un criterio de contabilización de la inversión extranjera en activos y pasivos en la economía, y el criterio de balanza de pago 5, que es el criterio tradicional de flujos direccionales, ¿no? Cada una de estas metodologías tiene sus pros y sus contras para analizar el fenómeno de las transnacionales, pero desde el punto de vista práctico, lo que sucede es que en la región son pocos los países que al día de hoy uno puede analizar los flujos con direccionales, con balanza de pago 5, y con criterio de activos pasivos, y digamos, uno podría elegir qué metodología usar. A la fecha, la gran mayoría lo está haciendo con balanza de pago 6, y son pocos los que están los dos. Entonces, actualmente nosotros estamos digamos, presentando la información en los informes con el criterio de balanza de pago 6 de activos y pasivos, que eso tiene algunas particularidades que es interesante tener en cuenta. A nivel general, el tipo de información de flujos a través de balanza de pagos nos permite sacar conclusiones muy generales de cómo está evolucionando. En este caso, por ejemplo, son las entradas de inversión extranjera directa en América Latina y el Caribe en los últimos 11 años. Entonces uno ve, bueno, en el promedio en inicios de la década de 2010 había un boom de precios de materias primas, también la región estaba creciendo a tasas elevadas, la inversión extranjera directa es fuertemente procíclica, entonces hubo un crecimiento, se llegaron a máximos históricos de entradas de inversión extranjera directa, y después empieza a haber un declive y un estancamiento en los últimos años, claramente una fuerte caída en 2020, producto de la crisis económica de la pandemia, y nos permite establecer conclusiones como ver, bueno, cómo son las entradas de IED con respecto al Producto Interno Bruto en la región, qué porcentaje representa, en la década ha sido más o menos un 3%, el año pasado menos, 2.5%, y tomar así, como algunas conclusiones generales, ¿no? Y comparar con el resto del mundo en este tipo de análisis general. Si uno quiere ya entrar a análisis más detallados, una primera opción que da justamente la información de balanza de pagos es ver cuáles son los componentes de la IED. Y aquí podemos tener, bueno, obviamente los aportes de capital, el equity, que se ve que hay una tendencia decreciente en la región en la última década, y después la reinversión de utilidades, que estos son digamos, el capital de las empresas que ya están establecidas en las economías de la región, y los flujos de préstamos entre compañías, que este justamente es el elemento que genera distorsiones entre una metodología, la metodología del manual 5, direccional, y la de activos y pasivos. Que en el caso de la región, estas diferencias son relevantes principalmente en México y Brasil, que son dos países que tienen empresas transnacionales de magnitud, ¿no? En los demás países, generalmente, si bien el componente de préstamos entre compañías puede ser elevado, en el promedio en la región es un 20%, hay países donde puede ser más o menos, pero no genera realmente cambios de tendencia. En cambio, en Brasil y México sí puede generar un tema. Pero acá, nosotros ¿qué vemos ya? De los 32 países que teníamos información general, para los componentes, que es un primer desagregado y que permite, digamos, tener algún tipo de visión cualitativa, si bien no permite saber el tema justamente de qué es greenfield o qué son crecimientos de capital en fusiones y adquisiciones, ya solamente hay 28 países donde uno puede hacer este análisis, ¿no? Entonces, eso como una primera lectura. O sea, a medida que uno quiere avanzar en desagregar la información, cada vez son menos los datos con los que nosotros contamos desde las fuentes oficiales. Por ejemplo, un tema súper relevante para analizar el impacto de la IED es ver en qué industrias está invirtiendo, ¿no? Gran parte de las propuestas de mejora que nos presentaba María recién y de los análisis realizados parten de la base de identificar, bueno, estos flujos de capital transfronterizo, a qué industrias están yendo, y en base a eso después ver cuál es la emisión de CO2, etc. Si nosotros queremos ver la inversión extranjera directa por industria en América Latina y el Caribe, esos datos lo proveen 20 países, e incluso si nosotros queremos hacerlo de manera actualizada, por ejemplo, en el informe de inversión extranjera directa del año pasado, solamente 12 países tenían la información a la fecha. Entonces, eso lleva a que los análisis empiecen a tener rezago importante y que sea difícil tratar de identificar, bueno, en qué sectores están llegando. Por otra parte, está el tema de la desagregación también de esta información. No todos los países presentan la información en niveles de clase, en general es clasificación industrial uniforme, pero en nivel de secciones muy agregado, donde uno puede ver, bueno, recursos naturales, manufactura o servicios, pero donde no se puede ver qué hay dentro de manufactura, salvo en los países más grandes, donde ahí sí, se puede ver claramente, pero en otros no, qué es lo que está dentro de servicios y demás. Y uno puede ver acá las diferentes tendencias, pero la información agregada en general, o sea, necesitaría un poco más de desagregación, la información a nivel de los países, para poder tener información agregada más rica, donde uno pudiera ir más allá de ver qué hay dentro de manufactura. Otra lectura que es interesante y que justamente se planteó el tema de mejorar en el nuevo manual, es el tema de identificar quiénes son, de dónde viene esa inversión, ¿no? O sea, cuáles son los países de origen de estas transnacionales que están invirtiendo en la región. Acá, los países que nos dan esa información en la región al día de hoy son 17, ya vamos reduciendo el conjunto de información disponible, y el tipo de información que se presenta hasta ahora no permite identificar el último inversor, sino que tenemos el inversor inmediato. Entonces, por ejemplo, en el caso de América Latina y el Caribe, nosotros vemos que en la última década la Unión Europea aparece como en el 50% de los flujos que ingresaron en el periodo analizado. El año pasado bajó un poco, pero dentro de esa Unión Europea, como bien se presentaba en la ponencia anterior, hay inversión que viene de Luxemburgo, hay inversión que viene de Países Bajos, donde las empresas utilizan estos centros financieros por los beneficios que les brindan, y no es efectivamente inversión de empresas holandesas o de empresas de Luxemburgo que estén en la región. Por ejemplo, en Brasil, un gran flujo de capital de empresas de China entra vía Luxemburgo, de acuerdo a investigaciones que ha hecho el Banco Central de Brasil. Entonces, esto también limita un poco entender, y con esta idea de una visión geopolítica, si uno quiere entender de dónde están viniendo los capitales. Porque justamente al tener el inversor inmediato, no sabemos exactamente cuál es la propiedad última, ¿no?, de ese capital que llega a los países de la región. Entonces, algunos de los desafíos que nosotros vemos en términos del uso de información con balanza de pagos, el primero era justamente el tema de la metodología, ¿no? Actualmente estamos agregando en balanza de pagos 6, porque es el que la gran mayoría de los países de la región tiene, aunque esto tiene algunos desafíos también desde el punto de vista analítico, pero incluso así, o sea, hay países que todavía no han pasado al 6. Si uno quisiera ser muy estricto y decir tienen que estar todos exactamente en la misma metodología, tampoco lo podríamos hacer. Entonces, al día de hoy, si bien la mayoría está en 6, igualmente tenemos que estar mezclando un poco las dos metodologías. Como les decía, pocos países dan la información por destino, por sector de destino o por país de origen. Las clasificaciones de industria hacia donde va la inversión tienen un nivel de agregación muy elevado, excepto en Brasil y México, donde principalmente en México hay unas estadísticas bien desagregadas de la Secretaría de Economía a nivel sectorial. Ahí hay un tema también que es justamente por cómo se contabiliza, o sea, la información por sector o por industria está en formato direccional de balanza de pagos 5. Entonces también ahí a veces se generan distorsiones en cuanto a si uno ve la evolución general con una metodología y la evolución sectorial con otra, lo cual dificulta a veces establecer análisis y sacar conclusiones acerca de qué está pasando, dónde está haciendo la inversión, cómo están actuando las transnacionales en los países. Con respecto al origen de la inversión, el hecho de las inversiones a través de terceros países para aprovechar beneficios fiscales impide identificar cuál es el último inversor. Y además también lo que les decía, muchas veces el tema de la diferencia de tiempo, el retraso en que se presenta la información sectorial y por país de origen en los países de la región, que nos impide tener en todos los informes anuales esa información actualizada para todos los países. Siempre en general tenemos 12 países, 13 países, dependiendo de la fecha en que publiquemos. Entonces, para intentar justamente remediar algunos de estos temas, es que complementamos este análisis con bases de datos comerciales, ¿no? Que ahí, por ejemplo, acá estamos viendo, bueno, los anuncios de inversión, donde utilizamos una base de Financial Times, que uno ahí trata de identificar, bueno, cuáles son los anuncios que han hecho empresas transnacionales en la región. Hay información de 2003 a la fecha, los proyectos se presentan por empresa y por clasificación de industria, y tienen una estimación. Cuando la empresa no anuncia el monto, hay un estimado del monto y de empleo que va a generar ese proyecto. Este tipo de información nos permite ver, por ejemplo, lo que está graficado a la derecha es entre 2005 y 2019, la participación en el monto total de anuncios por sector en los países de la región. Entonces ahí nosotros vemos, por ejemplo, que bueno, las energías renovables ya se puede entrar en un nivel de detalle mucho más interesante que simplemente tener servicios, donde ahí dentro sabemos que está energía, telecomunicaciones, comercio, servicios financieros, etc. Vemos el crecimiento que tuvo en la participación como sector de interés de las transnacionales, las energías renovables, cómo cayó el interés en hidrocarburos y minería metálica después del boom de precios de commodities hasta mediados de década del 2010 versus digamos, el fin de la década, y después también cuál ha sido un poco la evolución de los demás sectores. Claramente este tipo de información, además de que no es oficial de los países, con lo cual, y que además que es costosa, ¿no? Que eso no es menor, digamos, para los países que tienen presupuestos reducidos, a veces acceder a este tipo de información es bastante dificultoso. También muchas veces estos valores son estimados, se basan en anuncios de prensa, los proyectos pueden hacerse o pueden no hacerse, las clasificaciones industriales que se utilizan no son estandarizadas, entonces eso no siempre permite comparar esta información con la información que uno pueda tener oficial de los países de empleo, de estadísticas industriales y demás para hacer estudios comparativos. Entonces son informaciones que las utilizamos frecuentemente, permiten una lectura más rica del fenómeno de la IED en la región, pero que también tienen sus debilidades. Otra fuente de información que utilizamos ya para ver la parte de fusiones y adquisiciones y no de anuncios de proyectos es la información que provee Bloomberg. Esta información también no es una base de datos creada con estos fines, entonces requiere también mucho trabajo de depuración, de análisis de datos, de verificación de datos, porque Bloomberg, su objetivo no es que uno haga investigación sobre fusiones y adquisiciones, sino brindar información para los mercados bursátiles. Entonces, aquí, por ejemplo, en lo que está graficado a la derecha es, bueno, ¿quiénes son los principales inversores en la región a través de la modalidad de fusiones y adquisiciones? Claramente. Esto no implica que vaya a haber, digamos, flujos de capital que ingresen como FDI, porque muchas veces las fusiones y adquisiciones son de empresas que ya eran de capitales extranjeros, entonces ese dinero no va a ingresar a la región, pero nos permite ver, en este caso, de dónde vienen las empresas, ¿no? Y aquí sí hay uno puede ver más el último inversor y no tanto el inversor inmediato, y por ejemplo, analizando en América Latina y el Caribe los datos de fusiones y adquisiciones, se identifica que China ha tenido un peso importante, las empresas chinas como compradores de empresas latinoamericanas, cuando China en realidad, si uno analiza los flujos de IED por balanza de pagos, casi nunca aparece dentro de los principales 10 inversores. Tiene una participación muy chica, justamente por lo que les decía al inicio, de que muchas veces estos capitales o ingresan por otros mercados o por la modalidad de inversión, que ha sido principalmente de fusiones y adquisiciones, no se ve en los flujos de balanza de pagos porque es capital que va, en el caso, por ejemplo, de las hidroeléctricas, ha ido a comprar muchas que eran de empresas de Estados Unidos. En Brasil sí se puede ver porque ha comprado empresas que eran estatales, entonces ahí sí el capital llega a Brasil. Por lo tanto, también es información que permite lecturas, pero que requiere también digamos, cierto cuidado en el manejo de esta información para ver el fenómeno de las transnacionales en la región. Y después, más allá de estas bases de datos comerciales formales, claramente en los informes que realizamos y que se han realizado históricamente, hay muchísimo trabajo ad hoc, ¿no? Entrevistas a las empresas, información de las empresas que cada vez está más disponible en línea. Cuando empezaron los primeros informes aquí en la CEPAL, era mucho más desafiante, obviamente, conseguir información de empresas. Ahora hay mucho más y el desafío a veces es identificar qué información es buena, porque en este momento hay tanto acceso a información que el desafío a veces no es encontrar, sino poder saber qué es verdad y qué no. Prensa especializada, etc. Entonces, con este tipo de aproximaciones, a lo largo de la historia, obviamente se han hecho muchos capítulos temáticos, yendo a sectores específicos, industria automotriz, telecomunicaciones, economía digital, etcétera, identificando algunos países de origen, ¿no? Cómo es la inversión desde China, fue el año pasado, en otros años se ha hecho cómo es la inversión de la Unión Europea, cómo es la inversión que llega a Centroamérica, tratando de caracterizar un poco las particularidades de cada región receptora e inversora, y como les decía, o sea, cada uno de estos estudios requiere información ad hoc. Lo malo de esto es que la especificidad hace que sea difícil a veces después comparar el estudio sobre un sector con el estudio sobre otro porque estamos usando fuentes distintas. En cambio, cuando hay fuentes de información estandarizadas, es mucho más fácil poder tener panoramas comparativos a nivel regional. Entonces, para cerrar, claramente, y yendo al título, ¿no?, de este evento paralelo, nosotros hay muchos desafíos, claramente se necesitan múltiples bases de datos, el comportamiento de las transnacionales no se captura fácilmente con los datos que tenemos actualmente de balanza de pagos o incluso de las fuentes no oficiales, hay temas de comparabilidad, pero nosotros estamos, nos alegra mucho ver que hay cada vez más disponibilidad de información, que tenemos instancias como esta donde podemos discutir de primera mano con quienes están mejorando las metodologías de medición y que los países puedan cada vez también mejorar sus estadísticas oficiales para que los propios países puedan tener mejor información para definir políticas. Por ejemplo, en el caso de México se está haciendo un esfuerzo bien grande de parte del INEGE y con mucha información que tiene la Secretaría de Economía para tratar justamente de identificar, bueno, qué es Greenfield, qué son funciones de adquisiciones y tener mejor información también a nivel de dónde está yendo la inversión en temas sectoriales, en tema de regiones, de regionalización dentro del país. Entonces, hay esfuerzos importantes y nos parece bien interesante tener esta instancia justamente para que se impulsen, que se generen más espacios de cooperación y de esfuerzos conjuntos para que los países dispongan de cada vez mejor información que les permita a su vez después desarrollar mejores políticas, y nosotros desde CEPAL siempre vamos a estar tratando de aportar con investigación que les permita justamente también tener mejores elementos para definir políticas y tomar decisiones. Muchísimas gracias por su atención.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Thank you very much for the presentation. This is basically now we had two presentations. One, it was the challenges at the global level and as well some new avenues for FDI. And then we have the application of, in the case of Latin America and the difficulties. Now, I'd like to open the floor for discussion for there was already a question in the chat, but Maria already responded. So I would appreciate if you have other questions to ask the panelists. Please, Cecilia.
Sorry.
That's good.
It was an accident.
Okay. So since we are not yet having some questions, and I don't see any raise of hands, let's start with some of the questions that I have already prepared for you, Maria and Cecilia. And first of all, this was the discussion that Cecilia mentioned in her presentation about asset liability and directional. In UNCTAD, we are collecting the data as we are we get the data from the countries, but we always try to ask countries to send us the data based on directional data. And therefore, I'd like to ask an opinion from Maria, if it's possible. How do you see this type of data, and is that what is the importance of directional data in terms of FDI?
Well, thank you for the question. I have to say, I guess I'm old school. I prefer the directional presentation. I think for me, it's more intuitive to think about, you know, how much investment actually came in from a place or how much went out from your country, rather than to think of it in terms of assets and liabilities. That said, now that I'm at the IMF, of course, the asset and liability presentation, you know, does align with all the other parts of the balance of payments in IIP. And so it's very helpful for the kind of financial stability analysis they're interested in. But I think if you are interested more in investment policy, so how much investment are you attracting, what are the impacts in your economy and things like that, the directional principle still is the most meaningful. Certainly in terms of, I think the bilateral presentation, so when you're looking at specific countries or you're looking at industries, it also makes the most sense to say how much was invested by this country. I think that's really by nature a question that's best answered by the directional figures.
Many thanks, Maria, for this question and the answer, and I'm very glad to hear that as well, because we are working on that. But I mean, Cecilia, I don't want to say, I mean, we say that asset liability also gives the some trends there, and normally in your country the asset liability and directional, they are in the same direction. You know, they might have a difference in terms of the value in volume, I mean, but the direction is there. The problem is that in certain cases where there is a difference, when asset liability is increasing and directional is decreasing, then there is, I would say that it's better to focus, I mean, to use the directional data. So this was my first question. And the second one, and in fact, Maria, you responded in your presentation where how to use the for countries can basically use or produce data on ultimate investor with limited resources. Apart from that, what do you think, any other data that might be useful that countries can use or can collect given the resource constraints, in addition to the ultimate investor? Do you have any other idea for that? Thank you.
So, I mean, obviously everyone faces limited resources, and I guess you're sort of asking what would be the sort of prioritization. And so I think it depends obviously on where you are. I think if, for example, you're not yet participating in the IMF's coordinated direct investment survey, so if you're not yet doing the immediate investing country, that would be a very useful thing to do. And then, as I said, then you can explore the ultimate investing country. I think that's a pretty straightforward thing to do. I think one thing, and this came out in Cecilia's presentation, is that not many countries produce the industry breakdown. And I think particularly for your inward investment, that's very valuable breakdown to have, because it does help explain you know, a lot of the movements that you see in the FDI data, and it really helps you know where you're attracting investment and so on. So I would say, you know, depending on what you're already doing, those would be, if you're already doing the immediate and ultimate investing, then certainly the industry presentation would be very useful.
Thank you very much, Maria. And I think this last part of your answer is linked as well with a comment that I have for the presentation of Cecilia. We see that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we saw that FDI flows goes mainly to manufacturing and services. But if we look at the relation between FDI flows to Latin America and the commodity prices, there is quite a high correlation. And in fact, there is they are basically FDI flows in the region is quite sensitive to the commodity prices. So of course, Cecilia, you responded partly in your presentation that some of the countries they are presenting the data not in too much detail in order for you to split. But do you have any other comment on that? Why there is this kind of contrast between we have majority of FDI flows in manufacturing and services, while the FDI is quite sensitive to commodity prices? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question. Yes, there are several reasons. So one is that given the size of Brazil and Mexico as recipients of investments, we know that 92% of FDI inflows into manufacturing go to Brazil and Mexico. And in that sense, we also know that most of them go to oil and gas industries, but not at the manufacturing of refineries. And also food, and beverages. So they go to industries that are really based on natural resources and also metals. And so in that sense, it's manufacturing, but it's manufacturing based on natural resources. So there you have one first explanation. And the second one is, well, there are some countries that, like Costa Rica, for example, that they receive manufacturing in medical devices and in pure manufacturing industries. But the second reason is also that a lot of investments go for market access, right? And to exploit the market of the region. And when the commodities prices are up, also usually our growth is up. So we have a better economic situation, and that also attracts investments in services like retail and even energy, communications, and that. And also there's a third reason that is related with some research that you did at UNTAD that is related on how the data is presented, right? Because when you go in services, there's a lot of investments that are in trade and retail, but it doesn't mean that the companies are retail companies, but it's because of the activity that they are investing in the country. So it's tricky. Sometimes you see it goes in services, but it's not services. Maybe it's a logistic hub from, I don't know, a producer of food or some kind of another industry. So that explains a little bit why you can see the kind of paradox that you say, okay, it's manufacturing and services are the largest, but then they are related with commodity prices. Why is that? So I think these three reasons could be behind that.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a clear explanation. Now, I had only the last question is we had in October, last October, we have the symposium on FDI statistics in UNCTAD as a part of the World Investment Forum. And there were two interesting presentations in the symposium that has to deal with SDG indicators. So the question that I have for both of you is how to make the existing data more relevant to the SDG to improve monitoring of investment and financial flows into developing economies.
Well, that's a very big question. So I would say, some of the proposals that I talked about would provide a better information on how much of the investment that's coming into your economy is staying in your economy, which I think is what's important in terms of the SDGs. And I think also this presentation by the ultimate investing economy, which is where the money ultimately comes from, would also give you an idea of sort of the contribution of richer countries to financing these sustainable development goals. And then any increase, I think, in the, I guess, the detail available would help you understand where that financing is going. So is it going to infrastructure, for example, or elsewhere? So I think that kind of information could certainly help.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. I think that indeed the presentation, part of the presentation in your presentation target some of the SDG indicators and is useful for the users. Now, with all the please, Cecilia. Sorry.
No, yes. No, relating that question, I think that also it's important to improve the coordination within the country's different institutions in order to be able to do the kind of research that Maria was presenting, right? Because sometimes you have this administrative data from one institution and then you have the investment data from another, and sometimes you have to make them stick, like match them in a way. Of course, we have all this privacy and all the statistical secret that is extremely important, but also it will be very nice in order to have information that is related with the SDGs to be able to combine the statistics. For example, employment statistic, investments in R&D related with investment statistics. That would be amazing. And sometimes the data is in the countries, but it's in different institutions. And I think I believe better coordination could improve this kind of analysis.
Many thanks, Cecilia. Indeed. In fact, now in UNCTAD, the way how we are monitoring the SDG indicators, we are using secondary data, as you said. We are using greenfield investment, announced greenfield investment, and announced international project finance data, which have a much more detailed industry classification, but of course, with all the caveats that you said in your presentation. Now, I think with this question, I would say that we are now a bit 5 minutes more from the, or we are just on time, in fact. So I would like to thank both speakers, Maria.
Johnny, I
and
believe
Cecilia.
there is a question. There was a Maria that was, well, she had her raised hand, but now.
Alejandra, I don't think we have more time because at 2:30 we have to begin the session in 4 more minutes. We have to run to the building.
Yeah, very good. So now I think that with that, I'd like to thank again Maria and Cecilia. I'd like to thank ECLAC for organizing this event and this very important topic, and we would like to continue this type of collaboration in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the interpreters. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.